He thought it would be a harmless joke, a quick laugh to keep the audience entertained. But the moment he said her name, Jason Reed had no idea he had just handed the spotlight to the one person who would change everything that night. The stage lights burned bright across the polished wooden floor, casting long shadows behind the judges' table, where 3 industry veterans sat with practiced smiles and tired eyes. The crowd buzzed with low chatter, half focused on their phones, half waiting for something actually worth their attention. And then there was Emily Carter, standing just off stage near a stack of speakers, her plain gray cardigan blending into the background, her posture quiet, almost invisible, as if she had mastered the art of not being noticed. She wasn't on the program, wasn't listed on any flyer, just another backstage assistant helping keep the show running smoothly, adjusting cables, passing microphones, doing the kind of work no one applauds. Jason paced center stage, his voice smooth and confident, feeding off the audience's scattered energy. "All right, folks," he said with a grin that never quite reached his eyes. "Looks like we've got a little gap before our next act." A few polite chuckles rippled through the room. He scanned the wings, his gaze landing on Emily, and something about her simplicity, her stillness, made him smirk just slightly. "How about we bring someone new up here?" he added, his tone playful, but laced with something sharper underneath. "You," he pointed directly at her. "Come on up, don't be shy." The room turned, head swiveling, curious eyes locking onto a woman who clearly didn't belong in the spotlight. Emily froze for half a second, her fingers tightening around the coiled microphone cable she had been holding. A stagehand whispered, "He's serious," and the small push forward left her with no graceful way to refuse. The applause that followed was uneven, more amused than encouraging, as she stepped into the light, her sneakers soft against the stage floor. Jason leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound friendly. "Ever sung before?" he asked, though the hint of a grin betrayed the question. Emily nodded once, quietly. "A little," she replied, her voice barely carrying past the front row. A few audience members exchanged looks. One judge raised an eyebrow. Another scribbled something on a notepad without even looking up. Jason straightened, turning back to the crowd. "Well, let's give her a shot," he announced, clapping his hands together as if sealing a decision no one had actually agreed to. Laughter flickered again, light but unmistakable, and in that moment, the imbalance was clear. The polished host, the seasoned judges, the expectant crowd, all on one side, and Emily Carter, alone under the harsh white lights. On the other, she took the microphone from his hand, her fingers steady despite the weight of 100 silent assumptions pressing in from every direction. The room seemed to shrink, the chatter fading into a low hum as she lifted her gaze, not toward the audience, not toward the judges, but somewhere just beyond them, as if she was focusing on something no one else could see. Jason stepped back, folding his arms with a casual confidence, waiting for the awkwardness to unfold, waiting for the quick laugh that would justify the moment. But what he didn't notice, what no one noticed, was the subtle shift in Emily's expression, the way her shoulders relaxed instead of tensed, the way her breathing slowed, measured, controlled, like someone stepping into a space they understood far better than anyone watching realized. And for a brief second, just before the first note, the entire room held its breath without knowing why. The silence stretched just a fraction longer than anyone expected, long enough for a few people in the audience to shift in their seats, long enough for one of the judges to finally look up with mild curiosity instead of dismissal. And then Emily Carter opened her mouth and released the first note, soft at first, almost delicate, but perfectly controlled. The kind of control that does not come from casual practice or nervous improvisation. It comes from years of discipline hidden behind ordinary days. The sound floated across the room, clear and steady, and something subtle changed in the air. Conversations that had not fully died out moments ago now vanished completely, as if the room itself was listening. Jason Reed's smirk lingered for a second too long before it began to fade, his posture stiffening just slightly as he realized this was not unfolding the way he had planned. Emily did not rush. She did not try to impress with volume or theatrics. She let the note settle, then moved into the next phrase with quiet confidence, her voice carrying a richness that filled the space without force, each word precise, each breath measured. like someone who understood exactly how to command attention without ever asking for it. One judge slowly lowered their pen. Another leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowing not in judgment now, but in focus. The audience, moments ago scattered and restless, leaned in as one, phones lowering, whispers gone, and still Emily remained composed, her expression calm, almost distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far removed from the stage lights, and the 100 pairs of eyes now fixed on her, a place built from years of quiet resilience and unseen effort. Jason took a small step back, barely noticeable, his confidence no longer filling the space the way it had before, because now the space belonged to her, and everyone could feel it. The second verse rose slightly higher, her voice opening with a strength that surprised even those who were now paying close attention. The tone deepened, layered with emotion that could not be faked. It was not just technically correct, it was real, and that made it undeniable. One woman in the front row placed a hand over her mouth, eyes widening. A man near the back straightened, his earlier amusement replaced with something closer to awe. And on stage, under the unforgiving brightness of the lights, Emily Carter stood exactly where she had been placed as a joke, but she no longer looked like someone out of place. She looked like the center of everything, the kind of presence that does not need introduction, does not need validation, because it speaks for itself. And as she moved into the chorus, her voice rising with controlled power, something inside the room shifted completely, the energy. Turning from curiosity to anticipation, from anticipation to disbelief. Because now it was clear to everyone watching that this was not a momentary surprise. This was something far greater, something they had not expected to witness tonight. Something that made them question how they had missed it just seconds before. And Jason Reed, standing just off to the side, felt it more than anyone. The slow, unmistakable realization settling in that the joke was no longer his to control, and the story unfolding on that stage was no longer about him at all. By the time Emily reached the peak of the chorus, the transformation was undeniable, not just in her voice, but in the room itself. The air felt heavier, charged with something no one could quite explain, as if every person present had become part of a moment they would remember long after the lights dimmed. Her voice carried with a strength that did not shout yet commanded, rising and falling with precision that only comes from years of practice done in silence, unseen, unrecognized, and now, finally impossible to ignore. One of the judges, a former recording artist known for his strict standards, slowly removed his glasses, blinking as if he needed to see more clearly. Another judge leaned forward so far her chair creaked softly beneath her, her earlier indifference replaced with focused attention, and in the audience, people who had been laughing minutes ago now sat completely still, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief, because what they were hearing did not match the woman they had just seen step onto the stage. Emily did not glance at them, did not acknowledge the change. She remained fully within the music, her posture grounded, her breathing steady, her presence expanding with every note. It was no longer a performance offered to prove anything. It was an expression of something deeply rooted, something that did not need permission to exist, and that made it powerful. Jason Reed stood near the edge of the stage, his confident stance now replaced with a subtle stillness, his arms no longer folded but hanging loosely at his sides, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization. Because this was not a moment he could interrupt, not something he could steer back into the lighthearted tone he had intended. This was something else entirely, something bigger than the script he had planned. Emily moved into the bridge, her voice softening, drawing the audience even closer, the dynamic shift pulling them in until it felt like the entire room was breathing with her, every note deliberate, every pause intentional. And in those pauses, the silence spoke just as loudly as the music. No phones moved, no whispers returned. Even the staff at the back of the venue had stopped what they were doing, drawn toward the stage by something they could not ignore. And then, as she approached the final passage, her voice rose once more, not forced, not strained, but lifted with a clarity that cut through the space like light through glass. And in that moment, it became clear that this was not just skill, it was mastery shaped over time, hidden beneath ordinary appearances, waiting for the smallest opening to reveal itself, a single spotlight catching her face, calm and unwavering, while beyond it the audience faded into shadow, listening, absorbing, realizing all at once that they had misjudged something extraordinary, and Jason, standing just a few feet away, finally understood the weight of what he had set in motion, because the laughter that once filled the room was gone, replaced entirely by something far more powerful, a silence built on respect. And as Emily held the final note just long enough to let it resonate, just long enough to leave no doubt, the room did not react immediately, because for a brief second, no one knew how to respond to something that had just rewritten their expectations in real time. The final note lingered in the air, suspended for a heartbeat longer than expected, and then it faded, not abruptly, but gently, like a curtain closing on something no one was prepared for. And for a moment, there was nothing, no applause, no movement, just a stillness so complete it felt almost deliberate. As if the entire room needed time to understand what had just happened, Emily lowered the microphone slowly. Her expression unchanged, calm, composed, as though this was not the first time she had stood in a moment like this, as though the reaction did not define her, only revealed what had always been there. One of the judges blinked rapidly, his mouth parting slightly before he caught himself. Another leaned back in her chair, exhaling as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. And then, from somewhere in the middle rows, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant at first, uncertain, but real, and that single sound broke the silence like a spark, because within seconds, it spread, row by row, person by person, until the entire room erupted into applause that was no longer polite or amused, but overwhelming, rising to a level that filled every corner of the venue. People stood, not out of obligation, but because they could not remain seated after witnessing something that had shifted so completely in front of them. The judges exchanged glances, no longer assessing, but acknowledging. One of them slowly stood as well, nodding with quiet respect, and still Emily did not react beyond a small, almost imperceptible breath, her eyes scanning the crowd only briefly before lowering again, grounded, centered, untouched by the noise in a way that made it clear she had not come here to chase it. Jason Reed stood frozen at the side of the stage, the applause washing over him like something distant. His earlier confidence replaced with a tight stillness, because in that moment, the contrast was undeniable. The man who had controlled the room minutes ago now stood silent, while the woman he had called up as a joke commanded everything without saying a word. He stepped forward instinctively, microphone in hand, but hesitated, the words he had prepared no longer fitting the moment. His usual charm felt misplaced, almost small, and for the first time that night, he was not leading the room. He was trying to catch up to it. He began, but the sentence fell apart before it could form, because there was nothing he could say that would match what everyone had just experienced. One of the judges leaned toward their microphone, breaking protocol without waiting for cues. "What is your name?" The question cut through the applause, and slowly, the room quieted just enough to hear the answer. Emily lifted her gaze, steady, unhurried. "Emily Carter," she said simply, her voice the same calm tone it had always been, not amplified by the moment, not seeking validation, just stating a fact. The judge nodded once, as if committing the name to memory, while another judge leaned closer, eyes sharp with interest now. "Where have you trained?" The question hung with genuine curiosity, no longer dismissive, and for a brief second, something softer passed through Emily's expression, something almost reflective, before she answered. "I have not trained anywhere recently," she said, her words measured. "I just kept singing." A quiet murmur moved through the audience, the idea settling in, the realization that what they had witnessed was not the product of a spotlight, but of years lived outside of it. Jason finally found his voice again, forcing a smile that did not fully return. "Well," he said, trying to reclaim the rhythm of the show, "I think we just found our surprise of the night." The audience responded with another wave of applause, but this time it felt different, deeper, more intentional, because now they understood this was not a moment of entertainment, it was a moment of revelation. And as Emily stood there, still holding the microphone, still grounded in the quiet center of it all, the room no longer saw her as someone pulled in from the background. They saw her as someone who had always belonged exactly where she was, even if it took the entire room to finally realize it. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, rising and falling in waves as if the room itself was trying to hold on to what had just happened. But eventually, like all moments, it softened, settling into a quiet hum of disbelief that still hung in the air. Emily stood where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply waiting, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, while around her, everything had shifted. One of the judges leaned closer to the microphone again, this time without hesitation. "Emily," she said, her tone no longer measured or distant, but openly intrigued. "Have you ever considered performing professionally?" The question drew a ripple through the audience, people leaning in, curious now in a different way, not to judge, but to understand. Emily paused for a brief second, not out of uncertainty, but as if she was choosing her words carefully. "I used to," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the room. "A long time ago." There was no elaboration, no attempt to build a story around it, just a simple truth, and somehow that made it more powerful, because it hinted at something deeper without needing to explain it. Another judge spoke, his voice steady but filled with a respect that had not been there before. "You do not just used to sing like that," he said, shaking his head slightly. "That kind of control, that kind of presence, you do not lose it, you carry it." Emily lowered her gaze for a moment, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips, not from pride, but from recognition, as if she understood exactly what he meant, but had chosen a different path anyway. Jason Reed cleared his throat, stepping forward again, trying to re-establish his role. But even now, his movements felt more careful, more measured, as though he was aware that the balance had shifted permanently. "Well, Emily," he said, forcing a lighter tone, "I think it is safe to say you have changed the energy of the entire night." A few soft laughs followed, but they were different now, warmer, respectful, no longer at her expense. Jason gestured toward the judges. "I think everyone here would agree that was unexpected." He paused, searching for a word that felt adequate, but none seemed to land, and that pause said more than anything else he could have added. The audience murmured in agreement, but their attention remained fixed on Emily, not on him, and that was something he could not ignore. A production assistant stepped closer to the edge of the stage, whispering something urgently to another crew member. The schedule had been disrupted, the flow of the show altered, but no one seemed concerned about that anymore, because whatever had just happened mattered more than timing. One of the judges exchanged a glance with the others, then leaned into the microphone again. "We have a rule," she began, her tone thoughtful. "But sometimes, moments like this remind us why rules exist in the first place." The audience quieted again, sensing something significant. "Emily," she continued, "would you be willing to stay for the rest of the program?" The question landed with weight, not as an invitation, but as an acknowledgement, as if they were asking her not to leave the space she had just transformed. Emily looked up, her eyes steady, taking in the room, the stage, the faces that had changed so completely in the last few minutes. And for the first time, there was a visible shift in her expression, something reflective, something that suggested she was considering more than just the question itself. She glanced briefly toward the wings, toward the place she had been standing before any of this began, and then back to the judges. "If you would like me to," she said simply, her voice calm. The response neither eager nor hesitant, just honest. The audience responded with another wave of applause, not as loud as before, but deeper, more grounded, because now they understood what they were witnessing, not a performance pulled from nowhere, but a presence that had always been there, waiting. Jason nodded quickly, seizing the moment. "I think that settles it," he said, stepping aside once more, this time not as the one in control, but as someone making space. And as Emily handed the microphone back, her movements unhurried, her demeanor unchanged, it became clear that the most remarkable part of what had just happened was not the applause, not the recognition, not even the performance itself, but the fact that she carried it all with the same quiet steadiness she had when no one was watching. And in that quiet, the room understood something it had missed before. That true presence does not arrive with noise. It reveals itself when the noise falls away. The stage lights dimmed slightly as the next act was being prepared, But the atmosphere in the room had not returned to normal. It could not, because something irreversible had already taken place, and even as crew members moved quickly in the background, adjusting microphones and repositioning props, their movements carried a new awareness, a quiet respect that had not been there before. Emily Carter stepped off to the side of the stage, no longer hidden among cables and equipment, but not stepping forward either. She simply existed in that in-between space, where attention lingered even without effort. A few contestants waiting for their turn glanced toward her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. One young singer whispered to another, "Who is she?" But there was no clear answer, because the truth did not fit into a simple introduction. Jason Reed stood near center stage, glancing toward the judges, then toward Emily, then back to the audience. His usual rhythm disrupted, his timing slightly off, as if he was recalibrating in real time. "All right," he said, forcing a smooth transition. "Let us keep this incredible night going." His voice carried, but it no longer held the same authority, because the room had already experienced something that set a new standard, and everything that followed would be measured against it. The next performer stepped onto the stage, a talented singer with a carefully rehearsed routine, strong vocals, confident posture, the kind of performance that would have impressed the room earlier. But now, something was different. The applause was polite, the attention present, but there was a subtle comparison happening in every mind, unspoken but undeniable. Emily remained at the edge of the stage, watching quietly, her expression unchanged, not critical, not superior, simply observant, as if she understood something about the moment that others were still processing. One of the judges leaned toward another, whispering something under their breath, their eyes occasionally drifting toward Emily, as though trying to place her within a framework that made sense. But she did not fit into their expectations. She had not arrived through the usual channels, had not followed the predictable path, and that made her presence harder to categorize, which only made it more compelling. The performance on stage concluded with a strong finish. The audience responded with applause, but it did not reach the same intensity as before, and that contrast was felt by everyone, even the performer, who smiled but glanced briefly toward the side of the stage, toward Emily, as if seeking validation from someone who had not intended to offer it. Jason stepped forward again, regaining a bit of his composure, offering praise, guiding the show forward. But his tone carried a subtle shift, less performative, more measured, as if he had learned something in the span of a few minutes. And behind him, the judges offered their feedback, professional, thoughtful, but occasionally circling back to a comparison they did not fully voice. Because the room already understood, time moved on. Act after act took the stage, each bringing their own skill, their own story. But the memory of that unexpected performance lingered like an echo that refused to fade. And through it all, Emily remained present, not drawing attention, not seeking it, yet impossible to ignore, a quiet center in a room that had been recalibrated by her presence. At one point, a production assistant approached her, hesitating slightly before speaking. "They might ask you to perform again," he said softly, unsure how she would respond. Emily nodded once, not surprised, not eager, just acknowledging the possibility, as if she had already considered it, as if she had always been prepared for a moment like this, even if it arrived in a way no one expected. And across the stage, Jason caught a glimpse of her, just for a second, their eyes meeting briefly. And in that glance, there was no resentment, no challenge, just a quiet understanding, the kind that does not need words, because the roles had shifted, not through confrontation, but through revelation. And as the show continued, building toward its final segment, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone in the room, whether they admitted it or not. The night no longer belonged to the schedule, or the lineup, or even the judges. It belonged to a moment that had already happened, and the question that lingered in every mind was not what would come next, but whether anything could ever match what they had already witnessed. As the final segment of the evening approached, the energy in the room tightened with anticipation, not the usual excitement for a finale, but something deeper, something unresolved, because every person present knew that the most important moment of the night had already happened, and yet it felt incomplete, like a story that had revealed its truth but had not fully finished speaking. the lights shifted slightly, casting a warmer glow across the stage, and Jason Reed stepped forward once more. This time slower, more deliberate, his usual confident stride replaced with something closer to restraint. He paused for a brief second, scanning the audience, then glanced toward the judges, and finally, almost instinctively, his eyes moved to the side of the stage where Emily Carter stood, still quiet, still composed, still unchanged by everything that had unfolded. "Before we close tonight," he began, his voice steady but carrying a subtle weight that had not been there earlier, "there is something we cannot ignore." The audience leaned in, sensing what was coming, the room growing quiet again, not forced, but natural, as if everyone was aligning toward the same expectation. One of the judges nodded slightly, giving a silent approval, and Jason continued, "Sometimes, the most important performances are not the ones we plan," he said, choosing his words carefully. "They are the ones that remind us why we are here in the first place." A soft murmur moved through the audience, not disagreement, but recognition, because they had all felt it, whether they could explain it or not. Jason turned slightly, extending his hand toward the wings, not with the casual ease he had used before, but with a measured respect. "Emily," he said, her name no longer delivered as a prompt, but as an acknowledgement. "Would you come back to the stage?" There was no laughter this time, no uncertainty, just a quiet, unified attention as all eyes shifted to her. And for a moment, Emily did not move, not out of hesitation, but as if she was allowing the moment to settle, to become real before stepping into it again. Then, with the same calm presence she had shown from the beginning, she walked forward, her steps unhurried, her posture steady, and as she returned to the center of the stage, the applause began again, softer at first, then building, but never overwhelming her, never pulling her out of her composure. She accepted the microphone without ceremony, her fingers resting lightly against it, and for a brief second, the room held its breath once more, because this was no longer about surprise. This was about confirmation, about understanding whether what they had witnessed before was a moment or something far more enduring. One of the judges leaned toward the microphone, her voice calm but filled with genuine respect. "Emily," she said, "we would like to hear one more piece, something of your choice." The request was simple, but its meaning was clear. This was not a test, not a challenge, but an invitation to reveal more. Emily nodded once, her gaze steady, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not nervousness, not hesitation, but something deeper, something reflective, as if she was choosing not just a song, but a part of herself to share. The room remained completely silent, every distraction gone, every expectation reset, and somewhere in that silence, it became clear that this was no longer a performance inserted into a schedule. This was the moment the entire night had been leading toward, whether anyone had planned it or not. Jason stepped back, not reluctantly, but willingly, understanding now that his role was not to lead this moment, but to allow it. And as Emily lifted the microphone once more, the weight of the room shifted again, not with uncertainty this time, but with anticipation that carried a quiet respect, because now they knew who she was, not by title, not by introduction, but by what she had already shown them. And yet, somehow, it still felt like they had only seen the beginning. Emily Carter did not rush into the second song. She stood still for a brief moment, her fingers lightly resting against the microphone, her eyes lowering as if she was searching for something not in the room, but within herself. And that pause carried weight, not awkwardness, not uncertainty, but intention. Because this time, she was not stepping into a moment created by someone else, she was choosing it. And the difference was unmistakable. The audience felt it before a single note was sung. The silence deepened, no shifting in seats, no whispers, just a collective stillness that seemed to gather around her, waiting, respecting, understanding that whatever came next would not be casual, would not be accidental. It would be deliberate. And when she finally lifted her gaze again, there was something different in her expression, not just calm, but open, as if she had decided to let them see more than before. The first note came softer than the last performance, almost fragile, but perfectly placed, and it carried a different kind of emotion, not the quiet confidence of mastery, but something more personal, something that reached beyond technique. The melody unfolded slowly. Each phrase connected with a depth that made it feel less like a performance and more like a story being revealed in real time. One of the judges leaned forward again, but this time not to analyze, simply to listen, completely still, as if any movement might disturb what was happening. The audience followed, drawn in not by power, but by honesty, and that made it even more compelling, because now they were not just witnessing talent, they were feeling something they could not easily explain. Jason Reed stood at the side of the stage once more, but there was no attempt to reclaim control, no need to insert himself into the moment. He simply watched, his expression quiet, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to respect, because he understood now that this was not his moment to shape, it was hers to define. Emily's voice grew stronger as the song progressed, not louder in volume, but deeper in presence, each note carrying meaning, each pause filled with something unspoken, and the room responded without sound. The kind of response that cannot be measured by applause or reaction, only by the absence of everything else. Even the judges, who had spent years evaluating performances, seemed to have set aside their roles entirely. No notes, no whispers, just stillness, because what they were witnessing did not need to be judged, it needed to be experienced. And as Emily moved toward the final lines, her voice rose just enough to lift the emotion without overwhelming it, controlled, intentional, unwavering. And in that moment, the entire room felt connected to something larger than a talent show, larger than a performance, something that reminded them why moments like this matter, why they stay, why they listen, why they remember. And when the final note faded, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a release, a quiet exhale shared by everyone present. And once again, the room did not react immediately, because they had learned. They understood now that rushing to respond would only break something that deserved to linger. Emily lowered the microphone slowly, her expression returning to that same calm presence, unchanged, grounded, as if she had simply revealed what had always been there, and then stepped back from it. And in that stillness, before the applause returned, before the noise could fill the space again, there was a shared understanding, something unspoken but clear, that this was no longer about proving anything. It was about witnessing something real, something rare, something that could not be replicated. And as the first hands began to clap again, softer this time, deeper, more intentional, it became clear that the room was not just responding to a performance. They were responding to the truth they had just been allowed to see. The applause returned, but this time it was different from anything earlier that night. It was not loud for the sake of being heard. It was deep, sustained, and filled with something that could not be performed, because now every person in that room understood exactly what they had witnessed, not just a voice, not just a performance, but a presence that had never needed recognition to exist. And as Emily Carter stood there, holding the microphone for just a second longer before gently lowering it, she did not look overwhelmed. She did not look triumphant. She looked exactly the same as when she first stepped onto that stage, calm, grounded, unchanged by the noise around her, and somehow that made everything even more powerful. One of the judges stood slowly, followed by the others, not out of obligation, but out of respect, and the audience followed without hesitation, rising to their feet in a unified motion that felt less like applause and more like acknowledgement. Jason Reed remained still for a moment, watching it all unfold. The same man who had once controlled the room, now understanding that control had nothing to do with what mattered here. He stepped forward eventually, microphone in hand, but there was no performance left in his voice, only sincerity. "Emily," he said, her name spoken clearly, without irony, without distance, "thank you." And it was not a line, not part of the show. It was the only thing that felt true enough to say. Emily nodded once, a small, quiet gesture, not dismissive, not proud, just present, as if she accepted the moment but did not need it to define her. One of the judges leaned forward, her voice steady. "We would like to offer you something," she began, but paused, choosing her words carefully, because whatever came next carried weight. An opportunity to return, not as a surprise, not as an exception, but as someone who belongs here. The audience responded with another wave of applause, but Emily did not answer immediately. She looked out at the room, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, but observing, taking in the faces that had changed, the energy that had shifted, and for a brief moment, it felt like time slowed again, the same way it had before her first note. And then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I appreciate that," she said, her words simple. "But I did not come here to be seen." A quiet ripple moved through the room, not confusion, but attention, deeper now, more focused. "I just came to help," she continued, and there was no bitterness in her tone, no hidden message, just honesty, the kind that does not need to explain itself. Jason lowered his gaze slightly, a faint smile, forming, not from amusement, but from understanding, because in that moment, it became clear that everything he had tried to create at the beginning of the night had been built on surface, on reaction, on attention. While what Emily had brought required none of those things, it simply existed, and that was why it could not be ignored. One of the judges nodded slowly. "That may be true," she said. "But what you gave tonight, people do not forget that." Emily held her gaze for a second, then offered a small, respectful nod, not accepting or rejecting the statement, just acknowledging it. And as the applause began to settle once more, as the lights softened slightly and the show reached its natural close, Emily stepped back, not dramatically, not for effect, but quietly, returning toward the side of the stage where she had started, the same place where no one had noticed her before, and yet now, everything was different. People watched her go, not because she demanded attention, but because they had learned to see her, truly see her, beyond appearance, beyond expectation, beyond assumption. And as the final lights dimmed and the room slowly began to move again, conversation starting, chairs shifting, the energy returning to something